We had already been on mounted patrol for 4 hours and were on our way back to base. There were 4 Marines in the Humvee: Sergeant Pete Johnson, me, Lance Corporal Jim Rodriguez, Private Ron Damon, and the mounted team leader with the .30 caliber machine gun, Corporal Dan Adams. I had just told Dan, "You better get your ass down a little lower. There are enemies in this area." He replied, "Who cares? Let them shoot me." There was the sound of a .30 caliber sniper rifle shot. They say you never hear the one that shoots you. 3 of us heard it, but Corporal Adams didn't. He had a hole just below his right eye, and the only thing keeping the back of his head safe from shrapnel was his helmet. Private Damon jumped up on the 30 and returned fire, and we got the hell out of there. Rodriguez yelled. What the hell was he doing? Turning himself into a target? Poor bastard's been acting weird for a couple of weeks now. It just seemed like he didn't care anymore. That night, our guys and everyone else who knew Dan were grieving together when Captain Patterson, the company commander, came in. After everyone had gathered and been instructed to stand still, he looked at me. "Pete, I was packing up Corporal Adams' things to send to his wife. You, the rest of the platoon, and anyone else who wants to should read it." He tossed 2 letters on the nearest bunk and walked out the door. I picked up the first letter and realized from the return address that it was from Dan Adams' wife. I quickly looked it over and then, shaking my head, read it aloud. "Dear Dan, I'm sorry to tell you this, but I've met someone else, and I'm filing for divorce. I hope you'll understand. This loneliness of being away from you for so long is just too much for me. Please be careful. Pam." I put the letter back in the envelope and then opened the second one, obviously sent by someone else a few days after the first. Looking it over before reading it aloud, I had to just stand there and try to calm down before I was ready to speak. "Hey Dan, what do they call you guys? You and I didn't get along too well when you were here. I always wanted to kick your ass, and in a way I finally did. I've been sleeping with your soon-to-be ex-wife for a couple of months now. I gotta tell you, she's a great girl. As soon as she's divorced, we're planning on getting married. I'll send you an invitation. Maybe you'll be back by then. If not, I'm sure you'll send a gift. Ben." Everyone said in unison, "What an," or other words meaning the same thing. We could kind of accept a letter from the wife if she had to, but a letter from this guy, Ben, was totally unacceptable. I got together with 3 other guys who were with Dan when he got the letter. We were all from the same area, all Marine reservists from the same unit called to active duty. We were 3 months away from rotating home. We vowed that when we got home, we'd do something for Dan. Something to make things right. That letter was the cause of Dan's death. He was distraught after the first letter from his wife. Then came the letter from this guy, Ben. He was so depressed that he didn't even think to defend himself. The letter from Dan's wife at least had a purpose. The second one, on the other hand, was just plain mean. Neither of us had been really close friends before we were called to active duty. We knew each other through the usual reserve training and the annual 2-week field training camp, but otherwise we all lived our separate lives. A year of active duty, being together when we were constantly being shot at, had brought us very close. I agreed to take the lead in correcting this mistake. I didn't know what I was going to do, but Lance Corporal Rodriguez and Private Ron Damon told me to let them know when I needed them. Even a few other guys in the unit asked me to hook them up if I needed them.
I'm Sergeant Pete Johnson.
When I'm off duty, I'm Pete Johnson, a citizen, 27 years old, single, a graduate of Indiana University, and manager of one of my dad's tire store chains. I have a great mom, dad, an older sister who will take over the chain when dad retires, and a younger brother who is also an employee. Finally, we were sent home. If anyone was disappointed about going home, I didn't meet them. I was greeted at the airport by my father, mother, sister, brother, various uncles, aunts, cousins, etc., and that was the start of a party that dragged on until the next morning. I took a week off to reacquaint myself with civilian life and spend time with friends. I saved 2 letters. I told Captain Patterson I would keep them, and he just raised his hand as if to dismiss me. He wasn't going to say whether it was okay or not. He knew I had some use for them that he didn't want to officially know about. I showed my father the letters and explained the circumstances. I told him that I was going to go back to work, but that I might need time off from time to time. Dad had been in the Marines in Vietnam, so he knew how you get attached to your buddies. I didn't go looking for old girlfriends. I didn't have a constant when I left, and anything serious would interfere with my sworn duty to my fallen buddy, Dan. First, I needed to find out where Dan lived, which wasn't hard. His wife or ex-wife, as the case may be, must be in the neighborhood, as was that turkey, Ben. After getting Dan's address, I quickly found out that Pam had moved out, and the neighbors didn't know where she had gone. I assumed she had probably moved in with her new boyfriend, Ben. I started spending evenings at bars in his neighborhood. It's amazing how quickly you can become a regular at a local bar. First, I found out where Dan worked. Then, I started visiting bars in his former employer's neighborhood. Eventually, I came across a guy sitting on a bar stool who knew Dan Adams. He knew both him and his wife, Pam, from school. He didn't say anything about Dan's death or about him being in the Marines, but he did mention that he had recently seen Pam with friends at Maggie's bar several nights in a row. After leaving my tire shop, I stopped by Maggie's bar, becoming a semi-regular there. One night, I overheard a woman being called Pam. She was part of a group of about 15 people who appeared to be co-workers, unwinding after work. She was a fairly decent-looking young woman, not particularly pretty, but with a nice, slender body and an attractive shape. If this really was my Pam, I wouldn't mind getting her into bed, which I was going to do. I failed to mention that in college and throughout my career, I was considered quite handsome and always had good luck with the ladies. I'm 190 pounds, and I keep my body tone despite all the time I've spent in bars recently. If this woman was my Pam, and I figured she probably was, there was one big guy among the rest of her group who seemed to have an affinity for her. Probably that jerk, Ben. Ben was about what I expected. A big guy, about 6 feet 3 inches, 215 pounds, and looked like a guy who had been a bully all his life. He gave off the vibe that he thought he was a little more important than he really was. Than all the other troublemakers, he got to hang out with a few of the guys in Pam's group. They were playing pool, and I put my quarter on the table, indicating that I would play the winner. I won a couple of games and then lost, all the while starting to get to know the people in the group. Several people were dancing to the jukebox, and I asked one of the ladies, not Pam, to dance. She seemed thrilled with the invitation, and as I escorted her back to her table, she introduced several of her friends. 2 of them were introduced as Pam and her boyfriend, Ben. As I walked back to my drink at the bar, I heard several women giggling and asking the one I was dancing with, "Who's the guy dancing with G?" By far the most attractive of the group. I learned that they all worked for a commercial real estate company and came to Maggie's bar 2 or 3 times a week, always Tuesday and Thursday and sometimes Friday. On Thursday, I was at Maggie's and sat behind the bar again. When a group of realtors came in, I played pool with a few of the guys and then finished my beer at the bar. I ordered another beer, then walked over to the table where the ladies were sitting and asked another girl, not Pam, if she wanted to dance. I escorted her back to the table, and she asked me to go get a beer and sit with them. Over the next hour, I got to know some of the ladies and even started flirting with a couple of them, including Pam. The men in the group were friendly enough but really just tolerated me. I could tell that they wished I could find somewhere else to drink. I asked one of the girls to dance first, and a short time after that I asked Pam to dance. She readily accepted, and I noticed that Ben had been watching us closely the whole time. I could tell I was beginning to achieve my goal. I was becoming a topic of conversation for the ladies. A couple of times, when a new girl came into the group, I noticed people pointing at me. As planned, I became a topic of conversation for the girls in the office. I was well aware that one of the reasons I was attractive to all the girls was that I was new, and that has a limited shelf life. My plan had to move fast. After a while, you become just another piece of furniture in the room. Maggie's seemed to be more crowded than usual this Thursday. Pam showed up with her group of realtors, and to my pleasant surprise, Ben wasn't with her. When the dance floor got a little crowded, I asked Pam to dance. I pulled her a little closer this time, and she didn't seem to mind. When the first song ended, I took her hand and kept her on the dance floor until the end of the second song. Again, no objections. We danced the second one, and I walked her back to the table, holding her hand the whole way and sitting down in the chair next to her. I had sat with this group several times before and had danced with each of the ladies several times over the course of a couple of weeks. I was sure there was gossip in the office about which of the girls I would ask for a phone number, or something more than just a dance. If it was a group of guys, there would have been money bet on it by now. After dancing with a couple of other girls, I asked Pam again. This time, while we were on the dance floor, I asked her for her phone number, but I was ignored as if she hadn't heard me. After leaving the dance floor, we held hands, and I sat next to her again. A few minutes later, I felt something put in my hand under the table. I realized Pam couldn't be faithful to her man, in this case, Ben. When she was with Dan, she couldn't even wait another 3 months for him to be transported back to the States. She had to send him a Dear John letter. She wasn't the main villain in Danny's death, that was Ben. But all of Dan's friends, including me, knew she was partly to blame. Now Pam had won the prize at the office. She could go back and tell all the girls that I had asked her for her phone number. In her mind, at least in the short term, it was a victory. Ben who, throughout this whole process, I forced myself to think about with just my big head to avenge Dan. But my little head kept screaming, how about the one you really wanted to pursue? Gee, it was all about why I never got back into my life. My attachment to Dan and his unnecessary death, caused by 2 indifferent people. However, as part of my plan to get to know my coworkers, I really wanted to get to know G. I found out that she was divorced, had no kids, was 26 years old, about 5 feet 10 inches and blonde. And I also found out that I was absolutely in love with her. What a load of crap my brain had to deal with. My plan was to get close to Pam, drive a wedge between her and Ben, and then deal with each one separately. However, in doing so, Pam had to think that I had chosen her to stalk and not the other girls in her office. On the nights I sat at Maggie's trying to get closer to Pam, G was around, but I had to pay almost no attention to her. So beautiful, with soft eyes looking at me as if to say, please pay attention to me. A few days after I got Pam's number, I asked her to go to dinner with me. She replied, oh, I don't know. I'm kind of committed to Ben, but I guess dinner couldn't hurt. Naming a restaurant on the other side of town. Away from prying eyes, she said, how about Luigi's? I like their food. She asked me to meet her at Wendy's, which was a long way from the apartment she shared with Ben. We drove 30 minutes to Luigi's restaurant. After a bottle of wine and a very tasty meal, I asked, there's a bar down the street with a big dance floor. My friends say it's very good, and I should visit it. Would you like to try it? She thought for a moment. I probably shouldn't, but maybe we could dance a couple of times. We ordered drinks, which turned into 2, and danced until she started leaning into me. Why don't we go over to my house and have a nightcap? I've got some brandy you'll like. I didn't even give her a chance to answer. She found herself in my arms, our tongues entwined before she could say no. She said yes anyway, despite the fact that neither of us were supposed to be driving. I got us safely to my house. I got out of the car and opened her door. We entered my apartment hand in hand and sat down, talking for a while. Even though I was fulfilling my sworn duty to my buddy Dan, I couldn't help but reflect on how long it had been since I'd been in a real relationship. Spending too much time alone does something to a man. It messes with his head. At that moment, nothing else seemed to matter. I was caught up in the intensity of the moment, drawn to her despite the complicated history between us. I knew she wasn't someone I should be getting involved with, considering what she had done to my friend, but I couldn't ignore the pull. After resting for a while, we finally got to the brandy. We had another drink, and the conversation took on a different tone. More relaxed, more open. I set down my empty glass and reached for her hand, running my fingers along her palm. There was something undeniable between us, even if it was built on shaky ground. She lived with Ben and had told him she was out with friends that night, so we both knew this was risky. But for that moment, none of it seemed to matter. I told myself I wouldn't let things get out of control. I decided to let the gossip settle down before drawing any attention to what had happened. Pam was bound to tell someone about our encounter, which meant the whole town would know soon enough. The only thing I regretted was that G might hear about it too. To others, she and I weren't a couple, but to me we were, or at least, I wanted us to be. I hoped that when this whole situation played out, I'd have the chance to explain myself. A week later, I stopped by Maggie's after work. A few of the girls cheered as I walked in, but I ignored the noise and took a seat at the bar. Not long after, Ben walked in, flanked by two large guys. He made a beeline for me. "Pete, I never liked you," he said. "Now Pam tells me you were hitting on her and her friends while they were just trying to have a good time. If I hear you messing with my girlfriend one more time, me and my guys are going to make sure you regret it. And while we're at it, maybe you should stay away from Maggie's too." Before I could respond, the bartender, who also owned the place, stepped in. "Ben, I'll decide who stays and who goes in my bar." Ben shot me a glare as he and his guys turned to leave. "You heard me." I turned to the bartender. "If anything happens because of this, remember who started it." From that exchange, I could tell Ben had caught wind of the rumors. Pam must have told him a version of the story that kept her out of trouble, pinning the blame on me. I could only imagine how furious he would be if he found out the full truth. Things were coming to a head, and I knew it was time to get my buddies involved. Jim Rodriguez and Ron Damon were the kind of guys you wanted on your side in a confrontation. Whether dealing with a street fight or something more serious, they always had my back. Jim stood at 5 feet 10 inches and weighed in at 210 pounds of solid muscle. If he wasn't on assignment, you could usually find him in the gym. Like most guys in our unit, he was reliable, no questions asked. Ron was different. On base, he was a joker, always finding ways to get into trouble or make people laugh. But under pressure, he was the calmest guy I'd ever seen. He was about the same height as Jim but leaner, moving with an ease that made him dangerous in a fight. I called them both and asked them to meet me at a local bar the next day after work. Once I explained the situation, they each had a couple of questions. We talked about the two guys Ben usually had with him. They weren't really our enemies, we had no personal issue with them. But Ben? That was a different story. He had crossed a line when he betrayed Dan. Sleeping with Dan's wife while he was away was bad enough, but the fallout had been worse. The letter Pam had sent had broken Dan's focus, and that distraction had cost him his life. A sniper had taken him down before he ever saw it coming. Jim leaned back in his chair. "Hey Sarge, some of the guys from the unit heard about this. They said if anything goes down, they want in. I won't name names so you don't have to lie if things get messy, but they'll have our backs. If we can go in with a superior force, why not?" We made a plan, though we weren't sure exactly when we'd need to act. It would be either Tuesday or Thursday, the two nights Ben and his crew always went to Maggie's. We were ready for Tuesday, but when I saw that Ben had come alone, I knew it wasn't the night. He wasn't the type to make a move unless he had backup. I knew how to make. "It happens next Thursday for sure." He stood with Pam and looked at me. I walked over and said, "You warned me about not hitting on Pam in that bar. How mad would you be if I told you that there were no other girls at their bachelorette party? Just Pam and me. We had dinner at Luigi's, then went dancing, and then went back to my apartment. She's great. Maybe you haven't noticed, but those 3 little moles on the inside of her left thigh, right next to her tummy, she likes when you touch them. Well, it was nice talking to you. I have a date, I gotta go. I'll see you Thursday." Ben wouldn't let it go. He needed to settle things as soon as possible, and Thursday would be the next time I'd see him. I hoped he didn't take things too far. I laughed when I imagined him asking Pam about the moles, trying to confirm if what I said was true. They were real. When she was at my apartment, I had noticed them, things no one would know about unless they were close to her. On Thursday, we were ready as planned. Ron Damon showed up at Maggie's around 6 o'clock and sat at the bar, sipping a beer. He called to let me know what was going on. He saw the guy I described as Ben. It seemed that he and 3 other large men were standing apart from the rest of the crowd. Ben was moving back and forth between his 3 friends and the larger group, but the 3 friends didn't seem to know the others. Ron said one girl had a black eye and a bruise on her forehead. I described Pam, and Ron confirmed that it was her. Ben must have confronted her about what I had said. I showed up around 6:30 and sat at the bar but didn't immediately recognize Ron. Around 7:15, when it was getting dark outside, Ben walked up to me. "That's it. You've had your fun. Pam was playing games with me. Now it's your turn." I ordered another beer, making sure the bartender owner overheard the conversation so he would know who started things if anyone asked later. "Okay. Big talker, what do you want?"
Ben replied.
"Just go outside if you're not afraid." He nudged me toward the door. His 3 friends stayed on the other side of the room, probably hoping I wouldn't realize they were involved. I stood up, shrugged at the bartender owner, and walked outside. The owner reached for the phone to call 911, but I told him to hold off. While Ben and I exchanged words, my friend Ron Damon was sitting behind the bar, casually talking on the phone. Ben was joined by his 3 friends, and they followed me outside. When we stepped out, the atmosphere was tense. But Ben and his friends quickly realized they were outnumbered. A few of them hesitated, reassessing the situation. 2 of them decided to step back immediately. The third hesitated a little longer but soon followed suit. Ben, however, wasn't ready to walk away so easily. He was determined to prove something, but it was clear he was in over his head. Tensions ran high, but before things could escalate further, a bystander intervened, urging everyone to walk away before things got out of control. I didn't need to say much. The situation spoke for itself. Before long, Ben realized this wasn't going to go the way he had planned. With no other options, he turned and left. In the end, the night didn't go as he expected, but it went exactly as I had planned. Later, that if Ben ever started walking again, which we couldn't be sure he would probably need a cane. Also, he would probably never father children or even want to try. To an outsider, this would all seem pretty extreme just to get revenge. But as beaten up as Ben was, he could breathe and maybe enjoy life. That was something Dan had never had. The last thing I did before I called 911 was put a copy of his letter to Dan in my pocket. Someday he would find it and realize what the letter was all about. Everyone except Ben and me seemed to vanish. Ben's boys just wanted to leave. They hadn't gotten beat up badly, but they knew they were lucky and didn't want any more of that. The Marines got into their cars and went back to their lives, proud that they had avenged their dead brother-in-arms. 2 police officers showed up right after the ambulance took Ben away, asked the bar owner a few questions, and then left. I guess they'll get to me someday too, but they found out Ben started it, so they don't have to ask too many questions. The only person back in the house was me. Everyone had heard the commotion outside, but no one wanted to go out to see what was going on. I sat down at the table, looking directly at Pam, and pulled out a copy of each of the 2 letters. I said, "Some of you knew Dan Adams through his wife Pam. I'm sure you've heard that he was killed in action. But what you don't know is that Dan essentially committed suicide. He received 2 letters a week apart, first from Pam, then from Ben. He was so depressed that he couldn't defend himself from enemy fire. Pass them on and read them when you can. I was with Dan when he died." The commotion you heard outside was Dan's Navy buddies showing Ben and his friends that they didn't like his damn letter. The next day, I was standing in the parking lot of a commercial real estate company. At the time of the layoff, several people I'd met at Maggie's came out, and I waved to those who noticed me. Eventually, the one I'd been waiting for came out. As she approached, I shouted her name. With a surprised look, she walked over to my driver's window. "Hey Pete, how's it going? Gee, sometime when you have time, I'd like to explain what's going on between me and a couple of your coworkers." She smiled, walked around to the passenger side of the car, got in and said, "How about now? Somewhere not at Maggie's." That's how I met my wife and best friend, which was really a first. After that, we were constantly together and spent a lot of time getting to know my rather large family. Mom, Dad, my siblings all loved G, and eventually, she joined the rest of the family in the tire business. 2 years later, we gave Mom and Dad beautiful twin granddaughters. Ben was never able to return to work at the real estate company. He spent several years recovering and eventually went on disability. Pam worked at a real estate company for a while, but those 2 letters kept circulating. She eventually quit her job and moved out of state. Sometimes, I think about how good my life is with G and the twins and how Corporal Dan Adams was denied the chance for something like that because of those letters.